This is Chris with Phoenix Gaming, and today we're going to talk about Warhammer Old World. We're going to do the second part in our movement phase series. This should be the last part unless we have any requests from you, the viewer. We're going to dig right in with the remaining moves, and then we're going to cover maneuvers and important things to remember, and we're going to finish just by touching on conveyance spells again. I apologize for how I sound once again for probably the 10th time in the last 2 months. My kids have brought home some sort of illness from the school, so I'm just kind of struggling through that. Remaining moves. Once you have declared and resolved all charges and resolved all compulsory moves, you move to the remaining moves subphase. Units that are fleeing that moved during the compulsory move subphase or that charged are not able to move again this phase. Their movement for their turn has already been completed. This just means that if you've done any kind of movement before the remaining moves, you're probably not moving in the remaining move subphase. That's it. Very straightforward. Movement in detail. Most units sit in a formation, which we covered. These units are rank and file units, which we did already talk about in a previous video. There's going to be a card up at the top for you for that. Those units move in a straight line. Skirmishers move a little differently, which is covered in the same video that I just linked. They may perform maneuvers in order to change direction or pivot, and we will dig into that in just a couple of minutes. But let's take a look at basic movement. You see our rank and file formation of fellas down there. They have to move in a straight line, just like that. So if we wanted to move them, and we assume their movement characteristic is 4 inches, they would literally just move straight forward 4 inches, provided they don't perform any maneuvers. Here's how that's going to look on the table. And then they might move a little bit further up. And then when they complete their move, they're just going to be in the same position they were before, just 4 inches directly in front of them. Again, that's assuming they don't have any maneuvers that they wish to perform. Marching. Most units are able to march, and this allows them to move at a higher rate of speed. When marching, a unit doubles their movement characteristic. Again, there's exceptions to this, which are in that previously linked video. They also can perform a wheel when they march, but they may not perform any other maneuvers. And when a unit marches, it may not shoot in the shooting phase, and this includes casting magic missile or vortex spells. So anytime you march, you're forfeiting any kind of real interaction in the shooting phase. Just something to consider. As usual, it's a Games Workshop game, so there are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, this is the rule. Enemy sighted is a rule that triggers whenever you are within 8 inches of an enemy. You are not allowed to perform in March if there is an enemy unit within 8 inches, unless that unit is fleeing, or you pass a leadership test for the marching unit. So I want to march my unit, but you're within 8 inches. Line of sight doesn't matter. The rules don't say within 8 inches and line of sight. They just say you cannot march if there's a unit within 8 inches. So if I want to, I have to roll that leadership test, which is 2 dice, and I have to be under my leadership characteristic. If I fail the test, I still count as having marched, meaning just by performing the test, I forfeit my shooting interactions or any other interactions that march might trigger. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're deciding whether or not you're going to march or attempt to march while there are enemy units within 8. There are 6 total maneuvers. During the movement, a unit is only allowed to perform a single maneuver. Regardless of what maneuver you perform, you are never allowed to move more than twice the unit's move characteristic. And this is just to let you know, hey, even if you wheel, you can't move more than double, etc. The maneuvers are wheel, turn, move backwards, move sideways, redress the ranks, reform, and while pivot isn't a maneuver, it's kind of like a sub-maneuver that we'll cover in this section in a little bit more detail. Starting with wheeling, wheeling allows the unit to alter its direction. To make a wheel, you simply pick one of the front corners, and that corner becomes your anchor or pivot point. The whole unit counts as moving as far as the outside model, and units that aren't charging may wheel as often as they like as long as they have the movement to do so. What's going to happen is you're going to say, I'm going to wheel right or left. You'll pick the anchor point, and then the rest of the unit moves around the anchor point, and you'll measure from the model that moves the farthest. And I'm going to show you an example right now. So if this is our wheeling unit, we want it to move, but we also want it to kind of face this direction after it moves. So what we could do is if it moves 4 inches, we're just going to write all this up here for everybody to see. We could move it a couple inches forward, right? 2 inches. But then once it's up here, we could anchor it and then wheel it so that it's facing the direction we want. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to walk you through it with the picture on the table. So to start with, we just want it to move forward, it's 2 inches. So it moves forward 1 inch, it moves forward another inch, and we've now moved our 2 inches. We're going to pick this corner right here to be the pivot point. And we're going to start the wheel by measuring the distance this moved, and that's how we're going to do it. And now the unit has completed its wheel, and as I said before, what we would do is when we measure the movement of the wheel, we would just measure the distance this corner traveled from its starting position. This is all also covered in the same video I linked when we talked about wheeling with charges. A turn, effectively the unit just changes its facing by pivoting up to 90 degrees. For every 90 degrees you change direction, you use a quarter of your movement. If the unit has incomplete ranks, when you turn, they just shift to the rear of the formation based on whatever the new facing is. For example, if you're facing forward and you just want to turn around, that's 180 degrees. That takes half your movement. And then you just make the front rank, the new front rank, and then you make the rear rank, the new rear rank. Moving backwards and sideways, units may move to the rear. They do this by moving in a straight line backward without changing facing, and if a unit does this, it must have its movement characteristic. You can also move sideways, and it works the exact same way except you're moving laterally instead of in reverse. So if we move to the rear, that would just mean you're going in a straight line backwards, because you still have to move in that straight line. But if your movement characteristic's 4, it's now 2, because remember you can only perform one maneuver. The same thing for when you're moving laterally, we just go that way, and that would just be a sideways march. Again, you're just moving the 2 inches because you can only perform one maneuver. Redressing the ranks, you use half of your movement to move models to or from rear ranks in order to increase or decrease the front ranks. And this is just a fancy way of saying I want to take my 4x5 model unit of footmen and make it a 5x4 model unit of footmen. You still need to make sure that the ranks are as even as possible. Archers are going to use this a lot because as you move them to get them in place, they may be in some sort of marching formation. But once they get there, for example, if you had 20 archers, you might move them in a 5x4 to get to where they're going. But once they're there, you may redress the ranks to make them a 10x2. And this is just an example of how you would use it. Or if you have to squeeze through a narrow area, you may use it so that you're able to really maneuver through a piece of terrain, for example. The words were really hard for that, sorry. When a unit reforms, it forfeits its entire movement. It can pivot on its center and change facing up to 180 degrees. It can also rearrange its ranks and files to change and adopt a new formation. And it basically just means you get to do whatever you want. You can change your ranks, you can change your facing, you can change your formations. You just have to keep the same center point. Some important things to remember. Remember, I said we were going to talk about pivots. It's not technically a maneuver, but it is instead listed as parts of different maneuvers. When a unit pivots, most of the time it will be on the center. If it's not on the center, such as in a wheel, it will tell you when it is or where it is. When it pivots, it spins on the spot and ignores the presence of other units in terrain while it pivots. But it still has to end its pivot off of them. And sometimes your unit will cross over the edge of the battlefield when performing a pivot. And that's okay as well. Remember that the edge of the battlefield is not the actual end of the world, as long as you end that pivot wholly on the table or battlefield. Some quick rules about terrain and movement. Open ground and hills are all just treated as tabletop battlefield and do not impede your movement in any way. Difficult terrain. Any unit that moves through this feature suffers a -1 penalty to movement characteristic, and that is applied if any part of the unit moves through it, regardless of when it does, at the start, at the end, or somewhere in the middle. If more than 25% or 25% of the models are within difficult terrain, then they become disrupted. So if you're in woods and you get charged, you're now disrupted. However, if you're deep enough in woods, for example, and your opponent charges, they are also disrupted, so that could be advantageous for you. If charging through difficult terrain, when you roll charges, you will drop the highest die. So remember when we said you charge, you roll 2 dice and discard the lowest. If you're in difficult terrain, you actually have to discard the highest. Low linear obstacles are anything that are smaller than 2 inches, and they are just treated as difficult terrain. This could be small walls, etc. There is dangerous terrain as well. This hinders movement the same as difficult terrain. Really, it's just difficult terrain with more rules. When passing through dangerous terrain, you're going to make a dangerous terrain test, and you'll roll a die for every model that must pass even partially through, and on a roll of 1, that model suffers a single wound. If charging through difficult terrain, when you roll charges, you will still drop the highest die, because dangerous terrain and difficult terrain are treated as the same, except dangerous terrain has more rules. Impassable terrain just means you can't move over it without fly. If you found this video helpful, make sure you smash the like button. Make sure you subscribe. I am going to continue to break down the core rules for Old World, and we will also be looking at doing some of the army breakdowns and some different ways we could use some of the units. So if you've got an example of something you'd like a video made on, make sure you let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to cover the USRs, stuff like that as well. Big shout out to Kevin W., my first YouTube member. Appreciate it, man. You're awesome. Hatchling, the real Donnie G. Phoenix, Jamie, thank you. Immortals, Lord Wellingstone, Danny Boy, and Captain Too Tall. Once again, the support's phenomenal. I appreciate it. You guys are awesome. Have a great day.